For decades, whispers swirled behind the golden doors of Buckingham Palace, but no one dared to confront the truth. That changed when King Charles, weary and cornered, stood before his inner circle and uttered the words that shattered the illusion. Camilla's manipulation would no longer be hidden. His voice trembled not with weakness, but with the weight of a man who had carried silence far too long. This was not a carefully prepared speech or a rehearsed declaration. It was the breaking point of a king who had finally reached the edge of his endurance. Those gathered in the room, accustomed to measured tones and royal restraint, were struck by the fire in his words. For once, Charles was not speaking as a monarch bound by duty. He was speaking as a man betrayed in the very halls of his home. The tension in that room was suffocating. Courtiers exchanged glances, each one aware that they were witnessing a moment that would alter history. The air seemed to tighten as though the walls themselves had absorbed years of secrets and now demanded to hear the truth aloud. Charles's eyes darted between those present, searching for loyalty, measuring silence, and weighing the trustworthiness of the faces that surrounded him. His voice sharpened as he declared that what had been whispered in corridors and dismissed as speculation was no longer rumor, it was fact. For years, decisions had been guided by unseen hands. Choices meant for the sovereign had been shaped, manipulated, and bent to a will that was not his own. This was not merely a husband venting against a wife, nor a man voicing grievances in private. This was a king who had discovered that the crown upon his head had been subtly steered, not by tradition, not by counsel, but by Camilla's quiet orchestration. The words landed like a hammer against centuries of protocol. No one had dared to speak of Camilla in such a manner, not in his presence, and certainly not with such conviction. But Charles had stripped away the veil of pretense. He spoke of manipulation woven so delicately it had almost gone unnoticed, except for the gnawing unease that had haunted him through the years. Camilla, for so long confident that her control was unshakable, had believed herself untouchable. She had built a fortress of influence layer by layer, whisper by whisper, certain that no one, least of all Charles, would dare confront her methods. And perhaps that was her greatest miscalculation. For years, she had believed his silence was submission, that his hesitations were proof of her dominance. What she had not realized was that every pause, every reluctant nod, was also storing away a ledger of grievances. The king may have tolerated, but he never forgot. The moment he spoke, a collective gasp rippled through the chamber. Not dramatic, not staged, but the raw sound of disbelief, escaping from those who had believed themselves seasoned against scandal. The gasp was not merely for what Charles had said. It was for the implication that everything they had known, every decision they had accepted as royal command, had perhaps been tainted by one woman's manipulation. The illusions carefully maintained for decades now trembled like glass on the brink of shattering. And in those first fiery words, Charles unveiled the truth that had been hidden for too long. The courtiers leaned forward, some in fear, others in reluctant admiration. They knew that in this instant, the king had crossed a line from which there would be no return. He had chosen revelation over silence, confrontation over complicity. The age of quiet endurance was over. This was a sovereign ready to expose, to tear away the curtain that shielded Camilla's machinations from the light of day. But to understand the depth of Charles's revelation, we must trace back through years of subtle betrayals and ruthless maneuvers, acts hidden in plain sight. Behind every royal decree, every whispered decision, stood a figure who had mastered the art of influence. Camilla wasn't just a consort, she was a strategist, building her empire one whispered word at a time. Long before Charles's explosive revelation, her hand was already guiding the course of events inside the palace. What began as subtle suggestions soon evolved into carefully orchestrated moves that shifted the balance of power. At first, no one noticed. She played the role of companion, gentle and unassuming, her voice presented as nothing more than a quiet echo in the king's ear. Yet behind that exterior was a woman weaving a web that stretched across every corridor of the monarchy. The early signs were easy to dismiss, and perhaps that was her brilliance. A minor change in how schedules were arranged, a quiet suggestion on who should be invited to key events, or a whispered doubt about a family member's loyalty. Each move was too small to spark suspicion on its own. But added together, they formed a pattern that pointed unmistakably to her growing control. Those who worked closest to Charles began noticing the subtle shifts. His once firm instincts now seemed clouded, his decisions tinged with hesitation, as though waiting for an unseen approval before they could be finalized. Camilla understood influence not as an outright command, but as a gradual bending of will. She knew which courtiers could be swayed with kindness, and which demanded subtle intimidation. Some were drawn into her circle through charm, enjoying the sense of intimacy with the woman who seemed to hold the king's heart. Others feared her sharp tongue and the quiet power she wielded to remove those who stood in her way. In time, a network emerged, a silent alliance of advisors and aides, who answered not only to the king, but also, perhaps unknowingly, to her. Her reach didn't stop within the palace walls. Outside, Camilla worked tirelessly to transform her public image, aware that perception was a weapon as sharp as any dagger. She aligned herself with charities that softened her edges, leaned into causes that showcased compassion, and orchestrated appearances designed to make her seem indispensable to the monarchy's future. The press, often unknowingly, became her tool, with stories planting seeds that tilted sympathy in her favor and cast shadows on those she saw as rivals. Slowly, the public who once bristled at her presence began to view her through a different lens, one carefully crafted and relentlessly polished. It was this duality of charm and fear that secured her place as more than just a consort. Within the palace, staff tread carefully, unsure whether a warm smile or an icy glare would greet them. Outside, the nation saw the polished figure of stability at Charles's side. Few dared to question the contradiction, for challenging her meant risking one's own position, or worse, one's reputation. The palace, bound by tradition, could not openly acknowledge what many sensed but dared not say. Camilla was no mere companion. She was the architect of a silent empire, ruling through influence rather than crown. The foundation she built was invisible yet unshakable, rooted in quiet control that even Charles himself struggled to break free from. To most, it seemed natural that her presence shaped the monarchy's course. To others, it was a growing shadow cast across the throne. And as her reach extended further, the quiet ripples of her influence grew into waves that threatened to engulf the crown itself. But manipulation thrives on secrecy, and soon, Camilla's quiet strategies evolved into a dangerous game of power no one saw coming. One by one, the bonds that held the royal family together began to splinter, and in the shadows of those fractures, Camilla's hand could always be traced. What once appeared as ordinary family disputes now revealed themselves as deliberate divisions, carefully deepened to weaken the unity that stood in her way. Charles, caught between his role as father and his duty as king, found himself unable to mend the widening cracks. His children, once his refuge, grew distant as invisible walls rose higher between them. Every attempt at reconciliation was met with quiet resistance, and behind it all, the whispers of Camilla's influence lingered like smoke that could never be cleared. The relationship between Charles and his children began to suffer under the strain of unseen manipulation. Subtle remarks, carefully chosen words, and well-placed doubts poisoned moments that should have been filled with trust. William, sharp and intuitive, often sensed the intrusion, yet refrained from openly challenging it, knowing the explosive consequences that would follow. Each time Camilla's name surfaced, tension gripped the air like a vice. What should have been discussions about family turned into battles of silence, with William measuring every word and Charles sensing the unspoken accusations that lay just beneath his son's calm exterior. Anne, steadfast and unyielding, grew increasingly wary. She had watched the palace shift around her, decisions suddenly carrying an echo that was not Charles's own. She did not need proof to know Camilla's hand was present. Her instincts told her enough. Anne's suspicion deepened into a quiet defiance, her loyalty to her mother's memory clashing against the growing influence of her brother's wife. She became a silent guardian, questioning choices, probing intentions, and refusing to bow to the narrative Camilla sought to impose. But not everyone resisted. Andrew found in Camilla an ally when the walls of scandal closed in around him. Their understanding was not born of loyalty, but of survival. She offered him protection where others turned away, a shield from the storm of disgrace that threatened to consume him. In return, his support became another stone in the foundation of her control. It was a dangerous alliance, forged in shadows, that tightened her grip on the palace even further. Caught in the midst of this unraveling was Catherine. Graceful, steadfast, yet burdened with the knowledge of battles she could not openly fight. She carried the weight of silent conflict, her every smile masking the storm beneath. She understood the impact of division, not only on her husband, but on the entire family's legacy. Yet every attempt to bridge the rift was met with resistance, her efforts quietly undermined by forces beyond her control. For Catherine, the fallout was deeply personal. Her home, her children, her very future entangled in a struggle she had not chosen but could not escape. And at the center of it all stood Charles, isolated, weary, and torn apart by the very family he longed to protect. The crown, that once seemed a symbol of unity, now felt like a weight crushing him into silence. He saw the distance in his children's eyes, the suspicion in his sister's voice, the quiet suffering of his daughter-in-law, and yet he felt powerless against the tide. Camilla's influence did not simply divide. It left him stranded, a king surrounded by shadows, cut off from the warmth of the family that should have been his greatest strength. The palace was unraveling from the inside, but outside, the world was being carefully fed a different story. To the public, Camilla smiled as the devoted partner. But behind that polished mask lay a woman orchestrating a narrative so convincing that even seasoned journalists failed to detect the strings. Every smile, every gentle wave, every carefully chosen word during public appearances was calculated, not spontaneous. These were not the gestures of a woman simply supporting her husband. They were the tools of a strategist, shaping her image before the eyes of a nation. Step by step, Camilla rebuilt herself from a figure of controversy into one of reluctant acceptance, and in time, into something dangerously close to untouchable. Her mastery was not in open declarations, but in subtle manipulation of perception. Appearances were staged with precision, where she stood, who she met, which she embraced. Each outing softened rough edges and crafted a version of herself that was palatable to the public. To those watching from afar, she appeared warm, charitable, and even endearing. What they could not see was the machinery behind it, all the constant maneuvering to ensure her presence was always framed in the most favorable light. It was no accident that photographs captured her in moments of tenderness or that coverage highlighted her commitment to charitable causes. Camilla had learned that perception was power, and she wielded it mercilessly. Her reach extended deep into the palace press office, where briefings were filtered and narratives sculpted to her advantage. Stories unfavorable to her mysteriously disappeared or were buried beneath trivial distractions. Leaks, when they occurred, often redirected blame elsewhere, painting rivals in unflattering tones. Whenever her influence was questioned, counter-stories swiftly emerged, reinforcing her role as a loyal consort unfairly targeted by speculation. Even the journalists who prided themselves on independence found themselves ensnared in her carefully spun web, often repeating narratives that had been planted with deliberate intent. Camilla understood that the public needed symbols of compassion, and she weaponized that expectation. Charities became shields, not just causes. Aligning herself with organizations of high emotional appeal, she positioned herself as a figure of empathy and service. Yet, while the public saw selfless dedication, insiders recognized the truth. Each cause was chosen not from passion, but from strategy, ensuring she appeared indispensable to the monarchy's future. Every ribbon cut and hand shaken served to fortify her standing, turning acts of charity into instruments of influence. Her most dangerous tactic, however, was not in protecting herself, but in subtly undermining others. Rivals within the family often found themselves the target of whispers, carefully amplified into stories that cast doubt on their character or intentions. Camilla's fingerprints were never visible, but the effect was undeniable. While she rose, others stumbled, and in the ruthless arithmetic of palace life, perception often outweighed truth. She knew that as long as she controlled the narrative, she could reshape history itself. But as her influence grew publicly, Charles's private world darkened. The devoted image projected to the nation was a cruel contrast to the strain he endured behind closed doors. What the public admired as partnership often felt to him like entrapment. For every soft smile broadcast across television screens, there was a whispered word of manipulation delivered in the privacy of their chambers. The gulf between what the world saw and what Charles lived widened until it became unbearable, a constant reminder that he was sharing his throne with a woman who ruled not with love, but with control. Yet even the most flawless masks eventually crack, and Camilla's first slip would send shockwaves across the monarchy. Hidden in the palace's oldest chambers, a secret circle of influence gathered not for the king, but for the queen consort, who claimed the throne of hearts long before the crown was hers. These meetings were cloaked in silence, carried out in hushed tones behind doors. Charles himself was never invited to open. What began as informal conversations with advisors soon hardened into something far more dangerous, a shadow council that answered not to the monarch, but to Camilla. Every whisper, every exchange of paper, carried the weight of authority that should have belonged to the king alone. And while Charles walked the halls believing himself sovereign, a parallel kingdom was forming right under his feet. The discovery of these clandestine gatherings struck like a dagger. He had long sensed interference. Yet the revelation that courtiers, men and women sworn to serve him, were pledging their loyalty elsewhere, ignited a fury he fought to contain. Many of them owed their positions, not to merit, but to Camilla's patronage. Favors granted, privileges extended, debts repaid in silence. This was not loyalty built on tradition, but allegiance purchased in shadows. Their quiet compliance became her greatest shield, a web of obligations so complex that no one dared cut themselves free. Camilla understood the palace better than most. She knew its fragile balance relied on access to information, and she wielded that knowledge like a weapon. Documents meant for Charles were filtered, delayed, or discarded altogether. Reports that might have swayed his decisions never reached his desk. Instead, they passed through Camilla's hands first, edited in silence, until the truth became something else entirely. Each alteration, each omission, eroded his authority, turning the king into a figurehead while she operated as the true power. The manipulation was not limited to paper. Through her allies, she shaped conversations before they ever reached the king. Recommendations came to him already tilted, shaped to guide him toward her desired outcome. When he resisted, whispers spread of his hesitation, painting him as indecisive. When he complied, the illusion of his authority remained intact, while Camilla tightened her control further. It was a slow, deliberate erosion, so carefully executed that only fragments of truth slipped through. Enough to confirm Charles's unease, but never enough to expose the full machinery behind it. Rumors began to circulate among the few who still dared question her reach. Stories of meetings that stretched late into the night, decisions made in her presence without the king's awareness, and alliances forged not with the crown, but with the consort who had become its shadow. For Charles, every confirmation was a blade twisting deeper. Each realization stripped away the trust he once placed in those around him. The monarchy, an institution he was born to protect, was being reshaped behind his back by the very person who had vowed to stand by him. Charles did not rage openly yet. Instead, he watched. He listened. He studied the subtle betrayals unfolding around him. And in his silence, his anger hardened into resolve. Each closed-door meeting he discovered, each document withheld, became another stone in the foundation of fury that would one day erupt. Camilla believed her counsel untouchable, her grip unbreakable, but in reality, she was feeding the very fire that would consume her. The secret council was only the beginning of what Charles would uncover next, and turned suspicion into undeniable proof. Tucked away in a locked drawer were letters so damning, so carefully crafted, they revealed years of deliberate manipulation. Each word a knife aimed at the very heart of the monarchy. Charles stumbled upon them not in a blaze of revelation, but in a quiet moment of curiosity. When instinct drove him to search for answers he had long suspected but never fully confronted. What he found was not idle gossip or fleeting notes. It was a catalogue of betrayal, written in Camilla's own hand, addressed to figures of power who had helped her shape the monarchy to her will. The letters were precise, polished, and dripping with intention. They did not merely comment on palace affairs, they directed them. In their cold, deliberate language, Camilla laid out strategies to divide, to weaken, and to conquer from within. She spoke of managing William, of ensuring his influence never eclipsed Charles's own, not out of loyalty to the king, but out of fear that her position would diminish once the heir rose higher. In one chilling line, she suggested that Charles delay key decisions until William's proposals could be dismissed as immature or premature. These were not the words of a supportive partner. They were the words of a manipulator, ensuring her survival at any cost. Even more disturbing were the letters that reached beyond family conflict, touching on the very structure of the monarchy itself. Camilla wrote of her family's future, weaving subtle suggestions that placed her children and grandchildren in favorable positions, not by merit, but by proximity to power. She pressed allies to consider them for roles that had traditionally belonged to blood royals, cloaking her ambitions in the language of modernization. Yet, beneath the surface, it was clear. This was an attempt to secure her legacy, to carve her family's place into the royal order, and to rewrite tradition itself. For Charles, the experience of reading these letters was nothing short of devastation. Line after line confirmed what he had long feared, that his life, his crown, and even his family had been quietly manipulated, his choices bent not by conscience or duty, but by the steady hand of the woman closest to him. The betrayal was not just personal, it was constitutional. He was not simply a husband deceived by his wife, he was a monarch, undermined by the very consort who should have stood by him. The weight of that realization pressed on him like a crown of thorns, a bitter reminder that trust within the palace walls had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but within it burned something far more powerful: resolve. These letters were no longer whispers or suspicions, they were proof. And proof, once discovered, could not be hidden again. Charles's silence had protected Camilla for too long, but now he saw the truth with brutal clarity. The monarchy itself was in jeopardy if he continued to look away. The decision crystallized in his mind with terrifying certainty. He would no longer shield her from the consequences of her actions. The truth would come out, and this time, there would be no retreat, no compromise, no concealment. Armed with proof, Charles prepared for the moment that would redefine his reign, the confrontation the palace never imagined. The walls of Buckingham Palace had witnessed wars, weddings, and coronations, but nothing like this. Charles, with fury in his eyes, summoned Camilla. The queen consort would now face the king's wrath. This was not a conversation between husband and wife, nor a private quarrel that could be disguised as domestic strain. It was a reckoning, raw and unavoidable, and for the first time, the balance of power that Camilla had carefully constructed began to slip from her grasp. The tension between them was electric, every word Charles spoke charged with years of silence finally breaking open. The private meeting began with Charles's voice trembling, not with weakness, but with a rage that had long been contained. He laid before her the damning letters, the proof of her secret dealings, the confirmation that she had not only manipulated him, but corrupted the very core of the monarchy. He did not shout wildly. His words were precise, sharp, and relentless, cutting through the air with the authority of a betrayed sovereign. He demanded explanations, demanded answers, demanded truth, yet Camilla, the master of composure, fought to hold her mask in place. At first, she denied everything, dismissing the letters as distortions, the accusations as misunderstandings. Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to winning arguments in whispers rather than shouts. But Charles was no longer a man willing to be pacified. With every attempt she made to downplay the betrayal, his anger only deepened. He spoke of the fractures in his family, the loss of trust, the isolation he had endured, all while she built an empire of influence behind his back. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that the throne itself had been tainted by her hand. Her denial faltered, and in its place came silence, calculated, chilling silence. She did not confess, but her lack of defense was as loud as any admission. For the first time, Camilla understood the depth of her peril. The king's fury was not passing anger. It was the awakening of a man who had finally broken free from the chains of her control. His ultimatum was clear. The manipulation ends here. There would be no second chances, no return to the shadows. She could no longer wield the monarchy as her private stage. Outside the chamber, fragments of the showdown drifted through the palace corridors. Staff, long accustomed to whispers, now caught the sound of raised voices, the unmistakable rhythm of confrontation. Shockwaves rippled among them. This was no rumor, no speculative gossip. The king himself was confronting the queen consort, and the veil that had shielded her for decades was being torn away in real time. Whispers of what was happening spread like fire, and with them, the realization that the monarchy itself was about to change course. Camilla's greatest fear, the one she had worked tirelessly to prevent, was becoming reality. Exposure. The carefully constructed mask she wore for the public and the palace alike was cracking before her very eyes. For years, she had believed that her influence was unshakable, her hold on Charles unbreakable. But now, facing him in his raw, unrelenting truth, she saw the inevitability of her downfall. What she had dismissed as weakness had transformed into strength, and what she had manipulated with silence was now being shattered by his voice. But Charles knew exposure within the palace walls was not enough. To reclaim his crown, he would take his revelation to the world. When King Charles addressed the nation, many expected routine words of duty. Instead, what followed was a confession so raw, it stunned millions. The truth of Camilla's manipulation laid bare for all to hear. The speech began in the solemn, measured tone of a monarch fulfilling obligation, reminding the people of the weight of tradition and the endurance of the crown. But as his voice grew steadier, the words shifted. The formality gave way to fire. He abandoned the script expected of him and spoke with the unfiltered honesty of a man who had lived too long in silence. The king was not just addressing his subjects, he was unburdening himself before the world. He recounted how trust, the very foundation of his reign, had been compromised from within. He spoke of years of control disguised as counsel, of decisions stolen from him by manipulation that wore the face of loyalty. He confessed how even his family had been fractured by the silent strings being pulled in the shadows of the palace. The people who had always believed the monarchy to be unshakable were confronted with the image of a sovereign betrayed in his own home. And then he named her not in vague references, not in careful allusions, but in words that reverberated across the world. Camilla's mask shattered in that moment. The truth no longer whispered in corridors, but thundered across nations. The shock was immediate and unrelenting. Across Britain, gasps filled living rooms, pubs, and crowded streets as the weight of his words sank in. For years, Camilla had been presented as the steadfast partner, the woman who had stood loyally by his side. To hear her exposed by the king himself as a manipulator who bent the monarchy to her will was nothing short of devastating. It was betrayal on a scale the public had never imagined, and disbelief gave way to anger, to questions, to a demand for answers that could not easily be silenced. The monarchy itself trembled under the weight of revelation. Centuries of tradition were suddenly pierced by one man's truth, and though it threatened to shake the institution to its very core, it also unveiled something else: courage. Charles was no longer seen as a hesitant figure overshadowed by stronger personalities. He was a man who had found his voice, no matter how late. Though the crown appeared fragile in the aftermath, he stood taller than he ever had before. A sovereign willing to risk everything for honesty. The headlines that followed were relentless, plastered across every front page and news broadcast. King betrayed by his queen. Charles breaks silence on Camilla's reign of influence. The monarch's gamble. The story spread beyond Britain, igniting global fascination and outrage. Some hailed him as a hero for exposing what had been hidden for too long, while others feared the monarchy might never recover from such a revelation. It was the boldest move of his reign, a decision that would be remembered as either his greatest act of bravery or the moment that shattered the House of Windsor forever. Yet even after the revelation, the monarchy's future hung in balance because Camilla was not prepared to leave the stage quietly. The palace, once Camilla's stronghold, now stood divided. Some saw Charles as a hero, others feared the monarchy might collapse. And in the silence that followed, one chilling truth remained. Camilla was far from finished. The aftermath rippled through every corridor. Alliances shaken, trust broken, and loyalties questioned. Charles felt the weight of both relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was no longer hidden. Sorrow that it had come at the cost of his own family's dignity and the crown's stability. Yet, amid the wreckage, a flicker of strength emerged. William and Anne stepped closer, their unity with him undeniable, forming a shield against the storm that threatened to engulf the monarchy. The public, stunned by revelation, demanded not just explanations, but accountability. Their faith in Charles was cautiously renewed, but their anger toward Camilla burned hot and unyielding. Forced into retreat, she slipped into silence. But her silence did not surrender. She vowed quietly, bitterly, that her influence was not extinguished. And in that tension hung the foreshadowing of what was to come. For though the battle had ended, the war for the monarchy's very soul had only just begun. And so, as Britain watched with bated breath, the world realized the royal family's greatest drama had only just entered its most dangerous chapter. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.